Welcome back to How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess. Today, we are diving into a topic that touches so many of us. Our weight, our bodies, and the pressure women feel to look a certain way. I'm thrilled to have Christine Thomas on the show today. She is the author of the up-and-coming book, The Elephant in the Room, where she explores why women are worth so much more than they weigh. Christine challenges the idea that a woman's value lies in her appearance. She looks at how our bodies are expected to do it all, from nurture, care, adapt, yet we are still judged by the way we look. And she asks a question that really hit home. If diets worked, why do we keep going back on them? Today we'll talk about the cultural and emotional weight women carry, why dieting doesn't bring the fulfillment we are promised, and how to tune into your body's wisdom. And we'll also get into the hot topic of weight loss drugs like Wegovy and Ozempic. Plus, we'll tap into Christine's practical advice on dealing with all of the above. So welcome, Christine, to the show.
Thank you, and lovely to be here.
Christine, can you share a little bit about your background before we talk about your book and what you do now?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm a health economist, which is not a well-known term. I've spent my most of my career working in and around the pharmaceutical industry. And what I do is I look at evidence, and I look at the evidence that what happens in the real world. So a lot of the information that we see around scientific claims are based on clinical trials. But as we know, they're done in very specific populations. So what I do is I look at that evidence and I see how does that play out in the real world, and look and see what happens when, people take drugs or use lifestyle interventions, when they're not being watched and they're not being monitored as closely as they are when they're in a clinical trial.
Okay, so that's kind of, yeah. And what is it you actually do now, Christine?
So I still do some consulting. I've got a visiting professorship at the University of Sunderland in health economics, and
Okay.
I do various different projects for the NHS and for the biotech industry.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book, The Elephant in the Room, and why you come to sort of champion this whole, thinking about women's worth in a different way?
Yeah, so I think, I'd struggled with my weight all my life. And I think one of the questions that I sort of had myself as I hit my 50s was, why is it that I can be successful in so many different areas of my life? And this is the one thing that I just can't get on top of. And so I decided, initially I was sort of looking at it through the lens of my professional experience, looking at the evidence, why do we believe the claims about diets? Why do we keep going back on them? And then, as I went along this journey, I realized that it was so much more, weight and eating and dieting is so much more complex than just, what we eat and how much, and exercise we do. And we hear this sort of, eat less, move more mantra a lot. But actually, it's so much more complex than that, especially, I think, for us as women.
Yeah, no, definitely. And why, so where did that kind of interest lead you to then? You've written this book and you've obviously had these thoughts, but where are you at with all of this now?
Well, I think, I realised, looking back into my kind of, I'm a prolific journalist, so I had the benefit of looking back through all of these journals where I'd started these diets with great gusto and I'd lost weight. And I had lost weight, successfully, several stone on some occasions. And I looked back to see if I could see a pattern. Is there a reason why at some points in your life it's easier than others? Is there a reason why we're motivated at more times than others? Is there a cyclical element to it? What happens? Why do we gain more weight when we hit midlife? What is it about our bodies? And I realized, weight, like life, is not a steady state. And the idea that we're going to get to this weight and we're going to stay at this weight and that's where we're going to be happy, I think, is one of the misnomers that are floating around there. And I started to ask myself, why do I believe that I will be, happier or more successful when I'm thinner than when I'm not? What is there about that makes me think that being if there's less of me, I'm somehow worth more, And when I looked into the data, I found out that actually women who are overweight are paid less than their female counterparts. Yeah. Unlike men, And men who are overweight, if anything, are seen as, more commanding more respect or whatever. They're not given the same the influence on their wages. No. And yet, when we heard last week, there was a report out by the Office of National Statistics about how women earn, on average, about £1,000 less a month after the birth of their first child. So, a significant amount of money at a time when, expenditure's going up because children, aren't cheap, as we know. So it's really fascinating to me how, there's this kind of gender divide between the two, but also how we kind of get fixated in this idea that somehow somebody's credibility or worth is more when they weigh less. And the very fact that we have a size 0, I mean, what does that say? It's nonsense, really. That we think that we've got to be as small as possible in order to be, worth something. And so the more I researched this and the more I got into it, the more fascinated I become with was why. And I've got a lifelong yoga practice. I'm a trained restorative yoga teacher. I taught children yoga in schools for several years. So I was really interested about how these messages and how our engagement with our bodies have changed over time. Because what I have found is that as a society, we've become less connected to our bodies. We're very disembodied now. We live a lot in our heads and we feel like science and rationality and logic is going to trump everything else. And actually, as women, we hold an awful lot of information and wisdom in our bodies, but we have to learn to tune into those bodies and to trust ourselves and to trust our own intuition. Because, a lot of the diet plans and a lot of the healthy eating mantras that are out there are proliferated by what I call the white middle-aged men. And that they're coming out with ideas of, well, you just need to eat this or eat that, or just do this or just do that. But actually, as women, we're juggling so many other things. And I found when I had children, certainly, that my needs came after everybody else's. I'm focusing on getting food on the table. I'm focusing on feeding them. I haven't got the headspace to think about, well, actually, I haven't had enough grams of protein today, or I haven't done this today. So I think it's a very different argument when you're feeding a family to when you're just going at it from your own perspective and looking after just you in the equation.
Yeah. But why do you think we do? I mean, I can think of friends and clients that are, struggling with their weight or have lost weight and now feel so much better about themselves. But why is that? What is, because to me as a friend or, obviously, my business, I coach the Metabolic Balance Program, which is predominantly for weight loss and chronic issues like chronic diseases. And it really is very, very helpful at helping people reset. But it really is just a very simple program of, 3 meals a day with all natural foods. And just, it really helps people reset. But most people are wanting to do it because they want to lose a bit of weight as well. And it's still like, the number one thing I see in my clinic that people, really want. And interestingly enough, I had a client the other day and she lost all the weight she wanted to lose. And she, in my mind, she was looking really good, and, quite, yeah, she wasn't grossly overweight to start with, but, she really had sort of, kind of was quite slender now. And then she came in one day and she said, "Oh, Amanda, I'm feeling really low because people are starting to say to me, you've lost too much weight. You're looking a bit scrawny," and all these other negative comments were coming out. And I was thinking, wow, she looks wonderful. And she was then, so she'd gone from like being told she was overweight to now being told she was too scrawny. And it's like, how dare people, just how dare they? But it's interesting what you say, like we always want something. And once we attain it, we're like, oh, well, it's not really worth very much anymore. But why do you think we are so, do you think it is just the patriarchy that's driving this, that we're so harsh on ourselves? Because I think women are quite harsh with themselves, but they're also quite harsh with other women. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I can be watching the television and someone will come on and I think, oh, she's been taking, Ozempic or something for sure. I can think of a few celebrities, or she's had loads of work done. God, she looks different. And I'm a bit more judgmental. And I might see a man and I don't quite have that same conversation. And I kick myself for it and I pick myself up. But obviously I have been conditioned over the years to think a bit like that. So now when I go to think, oh, she's put on a bit of weight, or she's lost a lot of weight, or whatever I want to remark on someone's physique, I stop myself because I think, no, this is just an old pattern that isn't serving anybody. But yeah, war runs. Yeah.
I think you've touched on a couple of really important things. I think we have been conditioned, and it goes back to, my nan used to love women's magazines, but actually when I looked into it, right back to the 1950s, women were told in these magazines that you are less of a mother if you're fat. You owe it to your husband to be thin. And we have had this dieting message, proliferated since, the start, really, that we need to look a certain way in order to be valuable. We have to look good, and we have to lose weight to do that. So that's been a message that's been carried on for a while. But I don't think it's just down to the patriarchy. I think that's a really easy kind of way to go. And I do think there is a gender divide. But I think one of the problems is in my mind there's three problems. First of all, why do we think we can't do whatever we're doing now at the weight we are? Why do we think we have to lose weight? And I think when you look behind the motivations, people think that if they lose weight, they will get something. And it's not just about the fat. It's about that they will be more loved, or they will be taken more seriously, or they will be, more deserving in a way. Because we validate it. We tell everyone you look good when you lose weight. So you are good when you lose weight. So we have that kind of moral judgment there. And you're right, we all have this kind of, evil auntie in the attic, don't we? That the mind goes, oh dear, I've eaten that, or I've not eaten that, or she's looking a bit, or, it kind of goes on. And you're right, I think women are more critical of women. But I think the second thing, I think, one of the fundamental problems with the losing weight mentality is we don't really address why we've gained it in the first place. We don't look at what's behind the overeating. And this is what I had to really do a lot of work on in myself. Look back and say, what is eating giving me that I am not getting? Because what happens is you lose the weight and you look great, but when you get there, you find out that actually being thin, you are still you, and you still have the same insecurities, and you still have the same doubts about your ability. You still have the imposter syndrome. You still have the, unworthiness, whatever it is, that's still there. But also you haven't addressed, well, how did I get this way in the first place? Because, if it was as easy as just eating 3 meals a day, then, why aren't we eating 3 meals a day? That's all we know. We do not need, we have information overload. We know what nutrition looks like. But there is something about eating too much or eating the wrong foods that is fulfilling a need in us that isn't being fulfilled elsewhere. And that is quite, complex.
Do you not think also, so, I was talking about the metabolic balance in it's 3 meals a day. And I think one of the reasons have such success, or people have success on it when they're working with me, is because they're getting 7 sessions with me. So I'm kind of like, holding them to account, discussing exactly what you're saying. When did you gain the weight? What triggered it? What was happening in your life then? And that is so, so important. And then it's a case of like re-educating eating patterns and the way we eat. But I also feel that, with the food industry, which has had such a huge influence over how we eat in the West, that, they've been allowed to, make all these ultra processed foods in a factory. I mean, they're not cooked, they're not created. They're kind of like, they are made, they are manufactured, and a lot of us have been brought up on those, and, they put a lot of time and effort in, don't they? And tons of resource to make them as tasty as possible, so that you just want to, overeat on them. And, if you put fat, salt, sugar together, you never get sated. It overrides all your natural ability to say, I've had enough. And, if you read any of the books, anybody that's sort of talking about the GLP-1 agonists, the Ozempic, the Wegovy, Mounjaro, the people that are taking it, they will say, well, I've put on the weight because I've just eaten crap food and I got so used to that crap food that, I just couldn't stop myself. And, it's not like you said, we all know most people can just go online and find a diet that will work for them, but it's the sticking to it. And it's these tempting foods that often prevent us from staying on a real food diet. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think the food industry, it's really fascinating to me. You're right. The food industry has developed a very precise formula so that we eat food which fuels our feel good factors, and it's very addictive. I mean, some of it, almost like a drug, that we want to eat it again and we want to eat it again. And we have laid down those patterns, but it's also the association of those foods. So quite often things like, for example, I wasn't allowed sweets as a child, but I got sugar and I got sweets when I was upset or when something bad had happened. So I associated that with comfort. And it's not just a mental connection, it's something that is built into your body. So your body, when you get sweet food, it feels nourished, it feels comforted, and that's firing inside. And rewiring that is a bit more difficult, yeah, because you have to get to what's behind it. I think your point about counselling is really, 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 really relevant, because what happens in a lot of these diet trials and diet systems is that people are supported and coached, and they're made accountable. So, I have friends, I have people who I'm in contact with in my community who say, oh, it's weigh day tomorrow, so, I better be good, I better not eat, because I'm going to be weighed tomorrow. Or, I need to make sure that, I don't have that then, because they know that somebody's watching them. And we all behave very differently. It's called observer bias in trials, when we're being watched and when we're being monitored. But also, when we have accountability and when we have somebody holding us to account, we want to behave differently because we want to please them and we want to do well. So that's the other big thing. What's interesting about the diet foods and the diet industry that was sprung up was that the companies like Heinz, who'd made things like, I mean, one of my bête noirs is like Heinz tomato soup. I mean, I don't know if there's any tomato in it, but it's just, even just the colour of it is like lurid, and actually tomato soup's really easy to make. You just chop up an onion, throw in a few herbs, and toss in a couple of cans of tomatoes if you want. It's not difficult. But those companies then did exactly the same with the diet foods. They said, oh, we'll take the fat out, but we'll replace it with something like sugar. And then we'll take the sugar out and we'll replace it with aspartame or a sweetener. And they made those foods as addictive as well. So people haven't been taught really how to nourish themselves with food, because food is more than fuel. It's not just about putting petrol in the tank and, getting to the end of the road. We want to get something else from it. Food is a big social connection with food. There's a big, family connection. We have food at celebrations. There's a huge inference with it. And when I looked in the book at the different cultures and how they interact with food, it's hugely different. And you're right, in the UK, like America, food has become almost like this commodity. And we can no longer even sense when we're hungry anymore, because food surrounds us all the time. People have as many calories in a coffee these days as they used to have in a meal. I mean, it's frightening, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And you can get a snack, a coffee, 24/7 if you're, unless you're in the middle of nowhere. Even then, probably a garage or something open.
You don't
Yeah.
even have to shoot from your sofa. Deliveroo will bring it to you, and I think that's what's happened in this Western world. We have lost our ability to actually, we don't have to forage and look for food anymore like we used to. So we don't have that, but we still have that. Oh my God, I'm going to be hungry. I better eat. I'm not going to be able to have my lunch till 3:00. I better eat now. I have this anticipatory hunger.
Yeah. And again, I think that is the food industry, because I always say to people, look, if you're hungry, you're not going to keel over and die. You're just hungry. And actually, normally, if you wait, 20, 30 minutes, your body will produce glucagon, which is the, GLP, where the GLP comes from in the weight loss drugs. And that glucagon will tell, your liver to release some stored sugar into your bloodstream. And, that's a perfectly normal way of being. But we have been so brainwashed that if we're hungry, oh my God, we need a snack.
We're wired to fear hunger now. And I think, it's interesting. I was speaking to somebody who had no idea when I said, "What does hunger feel like in your body?" I don't know. Well, how do you know you're hungry? Well, because I haven't eaten. Yeah, but how does it feel? And I think we've lost that feeling sensation in terms of my tummy's rumbling, I feel a bit empty, I almost feel slightly nauseous, and we panic, and we just override our natural body systems so much now, rather than working with them and trying to kind of think, okay, actually I'm fine. Like you say, I'm not going to die. You know, it's okay to be hungry.
And I understand your book talks a little bit about, what we eat, how we nourish ourselves. Can you expand on that a little bit and how we sort of differentiate between eating and nourishing?
Yeah, so I think we focus a lot on food as fuel, and I don't think we think about how it gives us comfort and how it gives us benefit elsewhere. I mean, there's obviously a lot of, like natural foods have a lot of other goodness in them that you don't have in the packaged variety. And although, things like breakfast cereals where they say added vitamins, I mean, it's kind of nonsense, really. We can get what we need from food, and I believe our bodies can get what it needs from natural sources of food, without having to have all these additives in there all the time. And I think we need to think about it in those terms rather than, because it's a marketing paradise out there for food, quite frankly. We sold all these ridiculous claims, and they're based on absolutely nothing. You know, and I think people need to think about, what do I need right now? So, for example, like we were saying, a bit cold today. So I might want some nice soup for lunch because I want to be warmed up as well as fed, or, this kind of idea that food is just about, you know, filling our tummies. It's also about kind of replenishing our soul a little bit as well.
Yeah, because sometimes at lunchtime on a day like today, you can have a salad and you eat it and you're not that excited by it. It literally just feels like, yeah, fuel. Whereas if you made a hot soup or a chili or something, yeah. But, we talked about this earlier and I see this a lot and I sometimes catch myself doing it. And, you have to make the time for it. Or you have to be like organized. And I always say to people, you need to really be thinking about 2 or 3 meals ahead. And if you can't do that, at some point, you're going to fall over and eat some rubbish because, you'll get to that point. You'll come off a call. You'll be absolutely ravenous. It might be 4 hours, 5 hours since you last ate. And you go down, you go into your kitchen or wherever you might be and you buy something, make something, a piece of toast or whatever, because it's simple and easy. And it gives you a little bit of, a little bit of something, but it's not very, it's not going to sustain you for very long. And then 2 hours later, you're looking for another snack. And that is the problem that I see most people have, rather than having these proper meals that are, have protein and some fiber and vegetables and oils and, things that are going to, nourish your body. But how do we get back into that? And before we went on the call, Christine and I were talking about how we both have dogs now. And the first time in both of our lives, so we're in our 50s. And, how we like, oh God, I'm so busy, got to go and walk the dog. And actually, I was just sort of saying about, I had to reframe that walk and think, actually, it's such a privilege to go out with the dog, once or twice a day and get away from my screens and, my work. It's okay. It's okay to do that. It's nourishing for me. It's good for her. But it's the same. We have to have that same kind of mindset about food. It's okay to go and, maybe on a Sunday, spend a good few hours preparing some food for the week, making up casserole or, 3-bean chili or whatever it might be. But I think, again, we're out of touch of that a little bit, and that we don't put enough time and energy into what we put into our bodies, yet we give so much of our time over to, being on top of our emails or, always being on time for the meeting or always meeting the deadline. Yeah. And then you run into problems.
Well, time's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, the problem is that you fill your time. So, you have to have an honest conversation with yourself. And I say this in my book, really, about the stories we tell ourselves. I've eaten 2 biscuits, so I might as well eat the packet because I'm going to eat the whole packet anyway. Now, these kind of nonsense stories that we tell ourselves, it's the same with time. I don't have time. But we all have time to, as I say to my teenagers, but you've got time to watch YouTube and you've got time to, so we make choices. But I think it is a position of privilege, that like, for example, that we're in being able to walk our dogs in the day. Some people and some people's lives, and we know that there's a massive correlation between obesity and deprivation, for example. We've talked about natural foods. They are more expensive. And people do struggle to actually, feed themselves good food, because actually these these commodity foods have been made so cheap. And if you go into something like a budget supermarket, it horrifies me. There's aisles just full of crap, quite frankly. But they are so cheap and seductive, and I can see it, with my children. One of the big motivations for me was I don't want to pass on my insecurities to my children. Now, I probably have. But, it's very difficult when they're hungry and they want to eat something now to say to them, don't have the chocolate bar, have an apple. Because they're like, well, I want the chocolate bar. So you have to kind of get into some kind of ritual. I have a little routine. So when my kids come in from school, I've got some fruit cut up, some nuts, and they might have a little bit of chocolate or a biscuit or something with it. But it's kind of balance, and I think that's the important thing. We can say what the ideal is, but we've got to be realistic with people about how this fits into their lives. And I know some people, they're better with 6 small meals a day than they are 3 big meals a day. It's about finding out what works for you, but also what works in the context of your life. One of the problems I had when I went to a nutritionist was I said to her, that's great, but actually, on this day, this child needs to be there and this person's coming there and that's happening. So actually, I really put a lot of emphasis on us eating together as a family, but there probably are a couple of times a week where that's just not feasible. So I have to try and think about what's going to work for everybody, not just what's going to work for me. And I think we need to kind of, give ourselves a bit of slack sometimes and think we're doing as good as we can. Let's not beat ourselves up about food all the time.
Hey, just a quick pause to let you know that if you're navigating midlife and beyond, maybe feeling a bit flat or fed up with food, I've got 2 things that could really help. Firstly, did you know that I coach women through the Metabolic Balance Program? So if you're ready for something more personalised, this program is all about resetting your metabolism, supporting your hormones, and giving you a plan that actually fits your life. It helps you discover which foods suit you best, helps you manage portion control and satiety, and build healthy habits that last, whatever age you are. Want to know if it's right for you? Well, we can have a quick chat. You can book a free 30-minute call with me and we'll decide together. Secondly, my book, Feel Good for Menopause, is packed with real-life tips, simple shifts, hormone-friendly guidance, and plenty of delicious recipes to help you feel more like yourself again. So if you just need that bit of inspiration, do get yourself a copy. It's available on Amazon, or you can click the link in the show notes. Okay, let's get back to the podcast. And also, I think it's kind of like, a bit overused, but the 80-20 rule. I enjoy treats and, like everybody else, I'm not like, I think people think I have an immaculate diet and I write in my book about the Feel Good 4, and I do live by that most of the time. But again, when there are times, I might overindulge, I might go downstairs because I'm feeling a bit emotional and eat more chocolate than I would ordinarily. I don't beat myself up about it. I'm probably lucky now that I've been working in this industry for long enough to know all of this. But and obviously I've given it a lot of thought, and I've worked with so many women. But it is that kind of, I think sometimes that people will be really good for a long time on a diet, say, and then they come off it, and instead of thinking, oh, that's just one bad day, they're like, oh, I've trashed it now, self-sabotage, and boom,
Well, that's the packet mentality, isn't it? And I think the moralizing around food, though, as well, even just the language, good and bad, I think, we need to kind of move away from that and think about not just the logic around it, because it's a very logical kind of thing that we impose on it. Actually, what do we feel we need? I found when I looked at it, I'm actually eating because food's there, or I'm eating because it's dinner time, or I'm eating because other people are eating. But am I actually hungry? Do I really want this? And actually being able to have a bit of curiosity with yourself about, well, why am I craving to have sugar? What's going on here? rather than just getting into this, I've got to eat by rote and I've got to do this because that's what somebody else tells me. It's about tuning into how are you feeling and what's going on here and understanding that a little bit better rather than, as you say, feeling bad if you eat something that you think you shouldn't eat,
I'm sure you've come across Magic Pill by Johann Hari. Well, he's written about, the weight loss drugs, and he says that, he lived a lot on junk food and, Kentucky Fried Chicken and, all the fast food outlets. He was like one of their best customers, and he would feel, emotional, up, down, whatever, and that's where he would head. And when he started taking Ozempic, he went in there and, he was feeling a bit like low and he started eating the food and, you have 4 or 5 mouthfuls and you're like, oh, I don't actually want any more. You don't have those same messages to your brain. And then he kind of had to deal with his feelings because he couldn't, he couldn't get it from food anymore. Like this emotional eating, it wasn't actually, helping him anymore. Before it was sort of a distraction because he was upset. Now he couldn't actually physically eat the food because he was no longer hungry. So he had to sort of sit with his feelings and think, oh my God, shit, what is this? What's happening? And so that's kind of like a nice segue to the weight loss drugs. So, I'm talking about Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. These GLP-1 agonists work by mimicking the naturally occurring hormone that I talked about earlier, glucagon. And they help, regulate blood sugar, promote weight loss. We know they work on the gut, but they work on the brain as well. And, they stop people having the cravings for food and also for other things. So I'm really interested, Christine, what are your thoughts on these weight loss drugs? Are they the sort of panacea for people that are overweight, or are they best avoided? What have you done any research?
I've done a lot of research on this. So interestingly, when you talk about the brain and the gut, as you will well know, come from the same track in the embryo. One end's the gut and one end's the brain. So they're connected, and there's more receptors in the gut than there are for things like serotonin than there are in the brain. But we have this perception that the brain needs to override the body all the time. The bossy brain, I call it. And so people are saying, I don't have food noise anymore. I don't have, like you say, I don't want to eat this food. So I think that throws up a really big question is like, actually, why have we been suppressing these feelings and why don't we want to feel like that, to start with? But also, I think, again, it's externalizing the problem. We're saying something else, and this is the princess mentality that I think we do have as women as well. Something is going to come and rescue me. In all the fairy tales, the poor princess is rescued by the big, strong man. And it's the same, with the diets. I'll go on this and then I will be better. I will take the drug and then my life will be better. I think we're going to see the same problem that we have with the dieting industry in that actually it's a money-making enterprise. Instead of subscribing to Slimming World, we're now subscribing to Mounjaro. That's the reality of the situation. I can say with absolute certainty, having worked in the industry for over 30 years, having done pricing and reimbursement submissions for the pharmaceutical industry, their objective is not that we lose weight. Their objective is that we stay a loyal customer and we keep coming back. And that's what these drugs are designed to do. They're designed for people to make money. And of course, we're on this lovely crest at the moment. We've got all these people looking gorgeous and slim and beautiful. And again, it's this idea that that's where success is. That's where you've made it because you've managed to lose your weight and you've been successful. But ultimately, if that doesn't bring you what you hoped it would, which, like diets, it won't do, then, you're going to have to, at some point, look at, well, what was the eating bringing me? Why did I overeat in the first place? And what was that need? Was that satisfying? And if that need isn't being met, you will either go back to those behaviours, because that's what we do as humans, or you will seek it elsewhere. So I think it's really interesting. I mean, they are being sold as the panacea for everything. It's going to cure all these diseases. In fact, they were developed originally, as you will know, for diabetes. And interestingly, the diabetic population don't lose the same amount of weight as people who haven't got diabetes.
Yeah. So I think it's 15%, isn't it, for Ozempic and Wegovy? You lose 15% of your body weight in the first year. And with Mounjaro, I think it's like 20%. So
Only in the non-diabetic population.
in the non-diabetic population. Yeah. I mean, it is massive. And you can see, if you've been struggling with your weight, you can see the temptation, to take these drugs. I mean, I have friends taking them and clients taking them.
I feel like we've been here before.
Okay.
So from a dieting perspective, I don't know if you remember, but in the 90s we had Atkins, and that was going to solve all of our problems. We were going to eat lots of fat, so we could even eat the foods that we wanted to eat, and we'd lose all this weight. And people lost a lot of weight. They lost stones. It was marvellous. They reduced their risk of heart attacks, even though they'd eaten all this fat. It was the same story. Okay. And with drugs, we've seen the same story. So also in the 90s, we had, big waves of depression. We had the SSRIs, we had Prozac, the Prozac effect. Everyone was on it. It was going to be marvellous. We were going to solve the problems. But we didn't, did we? We still have people who are depressed. So I think we can see how this pattern is playing out. And I think, it's a lovely idea to think that if we take a pill, all our troubles will disappear. But life isn't really like that, because actually what we're dealing with is, the highs and the lows, the disappointments, whatever it is that we need to address. And that isn't not going to be found in a pill. That's before we kind of get onto, well, what are the long-term effects of this on the body?
Yeah, I mean, obviously these drugs have been used in the diabetic population for 18 years. And yeah, they're saying there haven't been any issues, but we know that, obviously it affects the gut. It slows down the emptying of your gut. So people I see sometimes have gut issues. You don't get the high from food, and someone will say you don't get the high from other areas in your life. It helps balance blood sugar, which is obviously a positive thing, but of course it's changing the way your pancreas works. So obviously there is that stimulating your pancreas to produce more GLP. And it's, there are side effects, aren't there? Like, pancreatitis, I think thyroid health.
There's been several deaths due to pancreatitis. In the MHRA website lists the number of deaths there that there's been seen for the pancreatic problems, which are far higher, I think, with Mounjaro than they were with Wegovy. Yeah. So there is always going to be, for every high, there is a low. And I'm not trying to scaremonger here, because when you use a drug in a wider population than it's been used in the clinical trials, we always see more side effects. We always see more serious side effects, more rare side effects. But the long-term use of these drugs, is not going to be, I think, favourable in the long term for most people. When we start interfering with the body and the body's mechanisms, we lose trust with ourselves. We lose the ability to tune into ourselves and to do what's best for ourselves. But I think also there's this idea proliferating around that we can somehow, avoid death. We can avoid all these diseases and we're going to be healthy. Now, there's a few problems with that. First of all, we are all going to die, and we don't want to face that, which is why we try and avoid it so much and why we go to such lengths. But actually, life is now, and we need to live now. We need to enjoy life now. The other problem I can see is that we've got this massive divide now. So the area that I'm involved in within payment and reimbursement is that the NHS don't have the money to fund everybody. In fact, the calculation I did said if we give everybody who's even just obese all these drugs, we will use all the money that is assigned to what's called the primary care budget. So the budgets for the drugs for people. All the other drugs, the heart drugs, the asthma drugs, everything that will cost it that much.
But there is that argument that, we're talking about using these drugs for someone who's overweight, maybe not clinically obese. And obviously there's a huge swathe of people that are buying Ozempic, etc., privately. But the people that are obese, there does seem to be quite a good case for them taking the weight loss drugs, because we know that being overweight does increase your risk of heart disease, diabetes type 2, and lots of other sort of, cardiovascular issues, etc. So for them, do you not see it being a positive for people that are? And if the NHS spent the money on the GLP-1 agonists, then they're going to avoid having to deal with the obese population having, diseases that have developed because they haven't dealt with.
It's a lovely idea.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. But the reality is we will get other diseases that will cost money. We will die of something. We cannot just avoid all these other diseases. What we've seen is my dad had a heart attack when I was 3 years old. He had his first heart attack. He was 34. And he went on a diet. It was the first diet that I remember. I mean, this is back in the 70s. He went on the milk diet, which is probably,
So how old was your dad when he had the heart attack?
34.
Oh, gosh, he was really young. Okay.
He was not obese. He was perhaps a few pounds overweight, but he went on a diet because it scared him. And he had a fatal heart attack when he was 46 and died, despite going on a diet, right? So there's no guarantee that by losing weight, we will avoid death.
But I think the data is there, isn't it? Just say that, if someone is obese and then they get their BMI into the healthy range, they will reduce the risk of heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And then just thinking about how much that's going to, how obviously awful for them, but how horrible it is for the NHS to suddenly have to come up with this huge amount of money to deal with them. And, I know Wes Streeting is talking, has talked about getting everybody that's obese these weight loss drugs because, that will prevent the NHS then having to deal with these people later on. So surely that is economically beneficial.
It's a lovely idea. But as I say, they will then go on it instead and maybe get cancer. They might get dementia, which costs a lot more money. We never avoid costs. As a health economist, I can tell you unequivocally that everyone will die of something and it will cost something. We're just kicking the can down the road, okay? I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't lose weight, absolutely, right? And of course there are big health benefits to doing it. But let's stop saying that we're going to avoid people dying, because we're not.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if you're obese and you had the option of taking a weight loss drug, and you don't take it, and you go on and you develop diabetes type 2, that will cost the NHS a lot of money, not just the diabetes, but all the comorbidities that go with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, but you might get those anyway, Amanda. You might lose the weight. You might lose the weight and get cancer, and that might cost the NHS money. You might lose the weight and get dementia and be alive for a lot longer. So what we saw was with statins, right? Statins came out. And I did the submission for simvastatin, which was the first of those drugs to NICE back in late 1990s, I think, maybe early 2000s. But we did that, and we modelled that, and we said exactly this argument. But we'll stop everyone having heart attacks, and it'll stop people dying, right? And it did, and they got cancer instead. And then we've done a lot of work in the last 20 years, and we've stopped the cancers, and now people are getting dementia instead. So we're not going to stop either death or cost, because those things will continue in another format. Okay, we can say we want to lose weight because we don't want to be obese, we want to be healthy. That's absolutely fine. But let's not say because it's going to save the NHS money. The NHS is not going to save money. It just spends it on something else instead. That's the reality. And we don't die of that. We die of something else instead.
It does seem like a compelling argument to me, if I'm honest, that if people lose weight, then they're going to avoid, diseases that they're most likely going to get. And, ultimately, it will, save lives. And
But so are we saying then that if people aren't obese, they don't get disease?
But they get less disease, and that's that is proven. They slimmer people tend not to get type 2 diabetes, not to get as much heart attacks.
No, but they might get cancer, or they might get dementia, or they might get they might get other things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the figures in front of me, but my understanding is that if people can lose weight, they generally will be healthier and have a healthier, older second half, whatever.
Have a healthier death. Absolutely, they'll have a healthier death, but they will die. And I think...
Well, I'm not saying they won't die. I'm just saying, they won't be diseased and they won't be taking lots of drugs, and which is very expensive for the NHS. But anyway, moving on from that, we'll agree to disagree. But going back to to talking about these drugs, it's really interesting to me as a nutritionist that what happens is when you do take the the Monjaros, etc., you lose your appetite. And what I see with people that I'm working with is they just stop eating. We all prompted, like at lunchtime, sometimes I'll be working and I really would rather not eat because it would save me an hour. But I'm really hungry, so I have to go and eat. And of course, I've got my nutrition head on, so I know that I need to nourish myself. But a lot of people don't have that, and they will just skip meals. And I don't know if you saw this in the press lately, but Robbie Williams, had scurvy because he was taking Ozempic and he just stopped eating. Now that is obviously, not everyone's going to end up with scurvy. I mean, obviously he is, quite an extreme individual, I think, isn't he? But I'm seeing this, that people aren't eating, enough food to nourish them. They're not getting enough protein. They're not getting enough fiber. And again, later on down the road, those things that might come and haunt them as their muscle mass kind of diminishes. And that is one of the side effects, isn't it, of these weight loss drugs, that you can lose, muscle mass. And as a midlife goddess, we want to hold on to our muscles because, it's quite hard to build them back up again. But, we know that if you have good muscle mass, that does equate to longevity and being healthier, and feeling better on a day-to-day basis. So I just wondered what you thought about people just taking them and how they're, how they're interacting with food on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point because, again, it's the women that kind of get highlighted with this. And I think there's a lot of people that are on these drugs that probably don't need to be on these drugs, but they're on them because they want to, look better and they can afford it. And so there's a big divide at the moment because actually the people who are obese that the NHS are trying to target or would like to target are actually the people that can't afford to buy this privately. And what we've seen is, and we had a big crisis, I think, at the beginning of last year when the NHS didn't have enough of the drugs for the people who needed them. The diabetics actually were on, high alert because the private market had taken off to such a degree, which the pharmaceutical industry did not expect, especially in the UK. Usually the private market's about 5%. It's very low. But with these drugs, people are so enamoured by them that they're buying them privately, and they're not cheap. And Mounjaro's just doubled its prices, I think, in September. And people, were having this big crisis. Well, shall I switch? Shall I stay on this one? What shall I do? But I think ultimately, because we are tuning our body out, again, we're tuning our body out, we're not being able to pick up when we need things like nourishment. And what I've seen, I'm sure you have as well in the press, is this Ozempic face. People have lost so much weight that they've got quite gaunt. I think Sharon Osbourne was kind of highlighted with this particular, almost skeletal, I would say. And then people are then coming in with like collagen and, Botox and trying to replace what actually the body needs fat cells to host, doesn't it? You can't have it if you haven't got the structures in place. So I think, it's really fascinating how we're not thinking about, we just think weight loss. And then actually, then what? Yeah.
Same price. Yeah. And, I was a teenager in the 80s and, I was so taken with the Barbie figure, and that's what we were all aiming for. And if you were going out for a night, you didn't eat lunch because you wanted to have a flat stomach. That just seems so ridiculous to me now, but that was kind of what society was telling you.
Oh, completely. Yeah, I was there with you. I was 8 toast for 2 weeks. Yeah.
And there's still a legacy there, isn't there? There's still that legacy. So, yeah. But, I do speak to people about this at some length, some, women especially, because men are like, oh yeah, I'm taking a weight loss drug. What of it? Or I'm a bit overweight, so what? They just sort of shoulder it and don't worry too much. Whereas women internalize it more. There's a lot of shame around it. And I think it's because of all those messages.
It's almost like a dirty secret. People said to me almost weekly, somebody says, oh, I'm taking Mounjaro. And I'm like, there's no judgment. People make those decisions, based on their own circumstances and what they want to do. But if you ask me whether I would take it, no, I wouldn't. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. And what would be your main reason for not taking it, Christine?
Because I think it's not going to solve my problems. It's not going to give me what I think, losing weight will. In the same way that dieting didn't give me that. And I made a conscious decision to stop dieting because ultimately, going on the diet, losing the weight, coming off the diet, putting it back on again, you just end up on this roller coaster all the time. And at some point you have to say, why am I eating? And why am I overeating? And what's that bringing me? And that, I can't address now, rather than keep this kind of, you know, ridiculous kind of feast or famine lifestyle, which is not good for the body either, because your body's so confused. It's like, well, are we eating this week or are we not,
But if someone's listening to you, I mean, obviously you've done lots of research on this, and you've done a deep dive with the research and with yourself. What would you tell if someone's listening and, they want to tune into their body's inner wisdom and, I know you talk about this, but how do they do that? How do they stop this cycle? I mean, it's all well, we talk about it. It's like we've been conditioned. Oh, it's awful. The patriarchy, I don't know, whatever, we're taking in, and we're giving ourselves a message. We've got to have perfect faces. And that's why, Botox and fillers are having a moment, and probably, have been having a moment, still having a moment. And the weight loss drugs. I mean, what should we be saying to ourselves? Why do we need these crutches so much? Why can't we just age gracefully, or however you want to put it, or just be happy with our bodies? What have you discovered that has just made you,
I think, it goes back to almost like the princess mentality. And we've done an awful lot, I think, in recent years to kind of, position women as, equal to men, and, having, empowerment and all the rest of it. And we've actually now got to start walking the talk and stop talking about it and start listening to ourselves, listening to our bodies. And different people do it in different ways, I try and give some people some ideas in my book about how I've done it to help them. But, I'm not giving you a 7 steps and this will get you there. I think you have to take control of your own life and your own destiny. And that is the single most empowering thing that I found, was actually you do hold the answers within yourself, but you have to stop and listen to yourself. You have to feel those feelings, however unpleasant they are. And you have to understand where they're coming from and let them go. And then you can start repairing your relationship with your body and with food and with eating.
Yeah. But how do you listen to your body? I mean, you talk about self-compassion. It does seem simple, but it's quite tricky, isn't it? So how can women bring that into their own lives when it comes to food, weight, body image?
Well, there's a number of different ways you can do it. I mean, and there isn't a one size fits all. But, for me, I found a lot of benefit through my yoga practice and through mindfulness, and through actually just sitting down, one meal a day, and sitting down there and not scrolling on your phone, not looking at the newspaper, not checking your emails, not being distracted. I mean, I grew up in the generation that ate in front of the TV, but actually eating food, looking at it, noticing, do I want this next mouthful? Even just putting my spoon down in between, taking, the next mouthful. I think rather than anticipating, I need to get the fork loaded up, with the next lot, really enjoying food and having what I call an embodied experience with it, where you're using all your senses. You're smelling it, you're looking at it, you're sensing it, and eating slowly, slowing down to eat, chewing every mouthful. As the saliva produces a lot of natural, endorphins when you eat, and it also makes, the more you chew, the sweeter the food gets. So you don't need, to have those sugar rushes. So the practices like that can really help people tune into actually why they're eating and what it's all about.
So kind of slowing down is what you're saying, whether it's with yoga or eating mindfully.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and just giving your inner self that chance to actually speak to you, or to listen to actually what it is you're feeling, rather than glazing over it.
Yeah, and not, so much now people eat on the go, they're rushing from one place to the next. They're not really connected with the fact that they're even eating, because they're doing something else. So actually just making eating, a practice, a habit, rather than something that we do, in between everything else. And just noticing, I noticed, it seemed to, when I'm cooking the dinner, I'm nibbling this and I'm nibbling that. Why am I doing that? Is it because it's there? Is it because I'm hungry? Is it because I want it? Is it because I'm actually interacting with food? And rather than judging yourself and saying, I can't have this and I must have that and I must do this, and putting ourselves in a straitjacket of it, trusting ourselves to know, well, actually, the reason that, I really want a bit of chocolate at that time of the month is because there's this kind of hormonal shift that's going on, and really having a bit more connection with our body so we can actually feel and sense what's going on inside.
Yeah. And how long do you think it took you to sort of get there?
Oh, it's an ongoing process, Amanda. It's an ongoing process. I think this idea that we've got to arrive, life is a journey, it's not a destination. And I think, we think we'll go on the diet, we'll lose the weight. We'll take the drugs, we'll lose the weight. But what happens when we get there? We still have to eat. We still have to live. So we need to think about just trying to stay present with what is now and being there, rather than thinking that our happiness or our success lies in the future.
Yeah. Good advice. And for someone maybe feeling a bit stuck or frustrated with their body right now, is there one small step that they could start using in their life today that you could give them?
I think what was a game changer for me was actually thinking rather as my body is a separate thing to me. It's where I live, and and actually it's done some amazing things. And I just wrote a list of everything. I've had 3 children. I've run a 10K. I started writing this list of everything that I've done. My body's done, and I kind of felt quite proud of it. And I stopped thinking of it as the enemy. And I need it to be smaller. I need it to be less, and started thinking of how much, my feet carry me around all day, or, just things like that. Thinking about it in, like you were saying at the beginning about the walking, framing it in, as a positive thing, rather than constantly criticizing yourselves. Because I think we do, my bottom's too big, whatever it is that we focus on the area of our body, and trying not to compare so much. Everybody's journey is different, and it's okay to be you,
Yeah, that's brilliant advice and a really good place to end. Christine, if your book is not out yet, is that right?
It's not out, it's out next year.
It's out next year. So that is, that is called
The Elephant in the Room.
The Elephant in the Room, and that will be available everywhere? Or?
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And if people want to connect with you, I know you're on Instagram. You can tell us I'll put in the show notes as well, but if you can just mention your...
Yeah, I'm Christine M. Thomas, author on Instagram, and my website is christinemthomas.com.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much, Christine. That was a fascinating conversation. Lots for people to think about.
Thanks a lot for having me, Amanda.
Thank you for your company. You can hear a new episode of Feel Like a Midlife Goddess every Friday. I know there are so many podcasts out there, so my promise to you is no nonsense, practical advice that adds real value to your life. So if you enjoyed this episode, you know the drill. Now, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, follow, or click subscribe, or even send it to someone who might benefit from this information. It truly helps me grow the podcast and keeps me going. And if you'd like to know more about my own personal approach to food, HRT, movement, stress, and self-connection, my book is available in paperback. I'd also love to hear from you, so don't hesitate to leave a comment or get in touch. And that just leaves me to say I am sending lots of love and light from my midlife goddess to yours.